Now, one thing we know about Henry VIII, which it doesn't take any kind of deep psychology to see this, is that he was very ostentatious. He loved to dress up. He loved to have parties. And he very much wanted to portray himself as this powerful monarch. And he wanted to be seen as a powerful king. So early on in his reign, he actually lost a lot of money because he spent it, all of the money that his father had left him, he spent in this war against France in 1512 to 1513. And so for a part of his reign, he actually didn't have a lot of money. But then during the dissolution, he was able to get, thanks to Cromwell, a large amount of land and capital when he sold the land. And a lot of that money that he got went into buying possessions, which are all laid out in the inventory. One thing that's interesting about this inventory is that there's no other inventory this detailed of an English king. Other inventories might talk about items themselves, but not weights or measurements of the items. Now, this inventory of Henry's is incredibly thorough. There's measurements of all of the cloth. There's measurements of the lengths of the ships, all of that. And the very first item in the inventory was the king's crown. That was the first item in the section that had to do with the jewels. They've actually been able to replicate the crown because of the detailed description in the inventory. And also it was depicted later in a painting of Charles I. So there's a YouTube video where Hampton Court was talking about how they were able to copy the exact look of the crown and really replicate the crown exactly how it would have been. It was amazing. It had 344 jewels and pearls. It was covered in rubies and sapphires and carvings of kings and fleur-de-lis. And later on, you actually can see it depicted in the background. There's a painting of Charles I, and the crown is in the background of that painting. And so the experts at Hampton Court were actually able to work with jewelers and goldsmiths and create a replica of the crown, which looks almost exactly like Henry VIII's crown would have been. It's very cool. So again, I have that YouTube video in the links as well. One interesting thing about that crown is that there were 3 sculptures around it, very small little sculptures on the sides of the crown. They had originally been 3 sculptures of Christ, but after the dissolution, those sculptures of Christ were taken off and they were changed to 3 of the major kings in English history who were almost had saintly status, and that would be Edward the Confessor, Henry VI, and St. Edmund. And they were using those to display the religious and the spiritual authority of the king, as well as the secular authority. So Henry was reigning as a king who was able to portray the fact that he was God's appointed in England, and that was displayed in his crown, which is very, very cool. It's also interesting to try to trace the items from the inventory and see where they are today. So there were some tapestries, for example, that were listed in the inventory at the Tower of London, which have made their way now to Hampton Court Palace. And so people try to trace where the different items went through the years. One thing about the items in the inventory is that a lot of them had been sold off by successive kings to help finance their own reigns. So they would pawn off the jewels or sell off different parts of the inventory. So it's interesting to see what Henry actually had in 1547 and then compare that to what later kings had and what parts had been sold off. So I just talked about those tapestries. Now, another part of the inventory deals with the tapestries and the other items that were in the royal wardrobe. In the Tower of London, there was the royal wardrobe, and that's where tapestries were kept. They were regularly aired out and cleaned. They actually had very technologically advanced pulley systems to lift them out, to hang them to air, as well as these presses and cupboards where they would keep them in good condition. It's estimated that one tapestry would cost the same to make as a battleship today. They were status symbols. They were things that you would hang up to impress royal visitors and ambassadors and say, look at how much money I have. I have enough money that I could pay 7 or 8 weavers working on this tapestry for 7 years to glorify me and to glorify my story. Who wouldn't be impressed by that? So tapestries were a huge part of the wardrobe. And as I said, there's still 2 that are hanging at Hampton Court today that were in the Tower wardrobe in 1547. They were kept in the Tower until 1649. They were in an inventory done in the Tower in 1649. But then apparently Oliver Cromwell took a liking to them and he moved them to Hampton Court after that. So they are now in Hampton Court Palace. Not everything in the inventory is completely straightforward. There were some really random items that were included in the inventory. Some of them would have been gifts from other rulers, and some were just things that Henry took a liking to. Sort of like when you're scrolling through Facebook and you see ads for really weird things, and you're like, I need to have that. Henry had some items like that. And we start to get a much fuller picture of the items that he surrounded himself with on a daily basis and kind of think about what he would have been doing on a daily basis with these items. One of the things that he had was a set of purple velvet bagpipes, which of course he was a musician. He was a composer. He played the organ. He played the virginals, the flute. And most of his personal collection of musical instruments was at Westminster Palace. They were maintained by a composer named Philip van de Wilder, who was given the title of the Keeper of the King's Instruments. And the inventory in 1547 lists more than 20 recorders, 19 viols, 2 clavichords, and 4 sets of bagpipes, including one made of purple velvet with ivory pipework. Henry also had a bowling alley. Interestingly, after the birth of his son, Edward, in 1537, he built a bowling alley at Hampton Court. It was over 200 feet long, so it was more than 3 times the length of a modern bowling alley. Bowling was really popular in Tudor England, but then Henry's daughter, Mary I, outlawed it. She outlawed the keeping of any bowling alleys, dicing houses, or other unlawful games in 1555. So, there she goes ruining the fun. But Henry did have a bowling alley in Hampton Court. Something else that he had that's kind of fun is he had commissioned a special pair, a custom pair of football boots, sneakers, trainers in 1526. A pair of leather football boots. They cost 4 shillings, which today equals about 90 pounds or about $130. And Henry was a big fan of football. Henry was a big fan of all sports. But then later in 1540, he actually banned football because he thought that it incited riots. So I actually did an episode on football. Gosh, it would have been during the last World Cup. I did an episode on soccer/football. So I'll include a link to that in the show notes too, because that was a fun episode to do. Henry also had some interesting pets. I did an episode on the menagerie at the Tower of London. Henry actually loved animals. He had ferrets, he had hawks, falcons, and lots of birds. In fact, the windows at Hampton Court were surrounded by cages that had canaries and nightingales in them because he just loved the sound of their singing. He also had dozens of dogs during his lifetime. After his death, there were more than 60 dog leashes found in his wardrobe in the inventory. But he also had a marmoset that he received as a Christmas present in the late 1530s. Catherine of Aragon also had a pet marmoset, which was included in a painting of her earlier that decade. So Henry had some interesting pets included in his inventory as well. There's also a very famous suit of armor that Henry had, a couple of suits of armor. In 1514, there was a suit of armor made for him that showed that he was 6'1" and he had a 32-inch waist and a 39-inch chest. But 25 years later, a suit of armor made for him in 1540 had a 51-inch waist and a 54.5-inch chest. So Henry had been eating very well for the past 25 years.